Hello, folks, and good evening for a new SACPA evening session. SACPA acknowledges that this event takes place on the land of the Blackfoot people and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, and we pay respects to their past, present, and future cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationships to the land. SACPA commits to assist reconciliation efforts by raising awareness of the ways past and present injustices can be reconciled. Today we're very happy to welcome with us from all the way from Australia, Dr. Moira Williams. Thank you very much for joining us. For over a decade, Moira has been a leader in the Australian grassroots climate movement, from building and supporting a national network of climate action groups to working with landholders, traditional owners, and coal-affected communities in central Queensland. For the last 8 years, she has worked on a campaign to keep coal in the Galilee basin, one of the largest untapped fossil fuel reserves on the planet, safely in the ground. She currently works with Tipping Point, a collective that works behind the scenes to support the national Stop Adani movement, one of the largest and most successful environmental movements in the Australian history. Sorry, I just couldn't do the Australian accent, so thanks for joining us, Moira, and we look forward to your talk.
Oh, thanks so much, Annalise and Mark. You did pretty well. Stop Adani, is the Australian way to say it. But thank you so much for you both and SACPA for having me here and for that great intro. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I want to kick off with that second slide there, Annalise, to really acknowledge that I am working and living on stolen Aboriginal land, to acknowledge the First Nations people of this country. I'm here on Yaga and Turrbal country, and also acknowledge that coal mining has really been a threat to Aboriginal land since the very beginning of when we were colonised here, and that invasion and occupation was driven in a large part by the quest for coal and other resources. I think there's a lot of parallels between Canada and here, but Aboriginal people have been fighting for land rights for a long time and often come against laws that are stacked against when it comes to mining projects and their right to say no to mining projects on their land. In fact, here in Australia, of 99% of applications that mining companies put forward to destroy cultural heritage are approved. And so right now we're seeing mining companies destroy sacred Aboriginal cultural sites across the country. So I wanted to acknowledge, First Nations people here and in Canada continuing to resist colonisation and extraction. And with that, I guess, we have a big fight ahead of us. So if you flick to that next slide, this is a headline from a Bloomberg article just last month. It's some really sobering news that the world burnt the largest amount ever of coal to produce electricity last year. So, you hear this thing that coal's over, it's dead. The reality is it's not over. It hasn't peaked. And, as people here that care about the world around us, we have lots of work to do to speed up the end to the polluting coal industry. Here in Australia, we're exporting record volumes of coal and have plans to continue to export coal to the world, effectively exporting climate chaos to the world. And one of the reasons for that boom is, if we jump to the next slide, that's some charts around how the coal price has boomed in the last few months. So, they are at historical highs, and that's really driving the continuation of, the viability of coal mines we thought may have become unviable by now. So that's some context. If we go to the next slide, here in Australia, this is a photo from the bushfire crisis a couple of years ago. You might have seen people being evacuated from beaches. And right now, haven't caught up and put a slide, a photo here, but we are experiencing unprecedented flooding across the east coast, including where I am here in Brisbane. We're seeing just down the road one of the largest floods that's causing mass evacuations and flooded homes and deaths right across the east coast of Australia. So we are feeling the impacts of the climate crisis, and we are also one of the biggest contributors to that climate crisis. We are the world's biggest coal exporter. The pollution from our coal exports, in fact, dwarf the amount of carbon pollution from our domestic emissions, whether that's transport, domestic production of pollution. So, yeah, it's a huge problem. And not only that, we have, close to 100 operating coal mines. We also have 60 proposed new coal mines and expansions across the country. And that's what I mean. Coal is not dead. They're still very much on the books and live projects. Keen to hear, how that compares with the situation in Canada. But if we go to the next slide, that really shows that here in Australia, we have more than our fair share of new proposed coal mines. So almost half of the new proposed coal mines are situated here in Australia. And that's pretty sobering. As a coal and climate activist in Australia, it's a huge amount of work to do, but I think it also shows how much, if we have a strong coal movement here in Australia, how much a contribution we can make to solving global climate change. In terms of, we know the climate crisis to address it and to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, and we saw the IPCC report released this week. Just on the next slide, we know that we actually have to keep 95% of known Australian coal reserves in the ground if we're going to get anywhere near meeting those climate targets. So we've got a big responsibility and deeply committed to kind of working as hard as we can to make that happen. The next slide starts to talk about, what are the impacts we're seeing of coal here in Australia. And just like everywhere around the world, coal is really harming communities. The air pollution from Australian coal mining, we know, contributes to the premature death of about 3,000 Australians. We have the highest rate of mammal extinction in the world. So we're seeing mining companies clear huge areas of land for mining, destroying habitat. And of course, the climate impacts that I talked about. Another one, which I think, particularly here in Australia, and one of the driest inhabited continents on Earth, is water. And it's pretty staggering the amount of water the coal mining industry uses here. It's the equivalent of about 5 million people's domestic consumption every year. And this photo on the left says it all. It's a picture of a coal train in the height of the 2019 drought, when the rest of the community was on water restrictions and towns were drying up. There was 2 enormous trains full of water were sent every single day just to keep one small coal mine from running. So it's a huge user of a very precious natural resource. If we go to the next slide, you get to see a picture of our current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. He's head of the coalition or the Conservative government, literally holding a piece of coal in Parliament, telling Australians not to be afraid of coal. And unfortunately, here in Australia, it's become a very divisive ideological debate between coal and renewable energy, and mining companies wield a huge amount of political influence, as do mining lobby groups. They spend tens of millions of dollars on advertising and lobbying. There's a revolving door between coal mining companies and government. So literally, it seems like if you leave government, the first job you have is in the biggest coal or gas company down the road. And we also see huge donations. A couple of years ago, there was donations of almost $2 million to the major parties from fossil fuel companies. So despite, high levels of public support for action on climate change here, the Murdoch-owned media also continue to provide space for climate denialism and don't argue that there is no link between, say, climate change and the bushfires or the floods that we're dishing out. So, that's the context. It's really a picture of state capture, where our politics have been so captured by a powerful mining industry that it's been pretty hard for many years to kind of get meaningful action on climate change. And both major parties have been big blockers to action on climate change and movement out of the fossil fuel industry. If we go to the next slide, I'm keen to provide some, that's kind of the broader context of coal here in Australia. I wanted to dig into one of the biggest coal campaigns here, which has been really become a symbol for the fight against coal, is the community campaign to keep the Galilee basin in the ground. And that's the fight I've been sort of dedicated to for the last 8 years. The next slide shows the deposits, coal deposits in Australia. So this is the east coast of Australia. I'm located here in Brisbane. That's like in the middle of the east coast there in Queensland. And the Galilee Basin, which is just sort of inland a little bit, about 300 kilometres from the coast. It's still the second largest proposed expansion of coal mining in the world. So after what is planned for Western China. If these mines, there was multiple companies vying to build mines in this basin, and if they all reached their full production, it could account for almost 6% of global climate pollution. And 10 years ago, we got wind of plans to massively expand all of those coal ports. So they're on the map there as well at Abbott Point, Hay Point, Gladstone. Expand those coal ports along the Queensland coastline and open up the Galilee Basin, which currently has no mines, and is situated 300 kilometres inland from the coast. The next slide actually shows, what if we map one of our precious natural icons, the Great Barrier Reef. Keen to hear in the chat if you've been to the reef, what you thought of it. It's a beautiful place. It's one of the largest, well, it is the largest reef system in the world, but it's also huge, right? That if you think about the country of Italy and how big that is, lying just off the coast of Australia, that would probably align with that blue line there, just to get an idea of its vastness. And unfortunately, those big coal expansions were planned to, massively increase shipping of coal. So coal is moved by rail from those inland coal basins out through those ports, and across the Great Barrier Reef. So huge concerns about the impacts to the reef, not just from climate change through bleaching of coral, but massive increases in ship movements. I had another slide there showing the beautiful diversity of fish in this incredible ecosystem. And the next slide I just wanted to show you for a bit of fun, because that's from 2013, 9 years ago. That's me in the pink swimsuit and some flippers when we first heard about these massive plans to industrialise the reef coastline. And we got into our flippers, got into the major centre of Sydney, a big city here in Australia, and snorkeled in the Hyde Park fountain, saying that, if we lost the Great Barrier Reef to coal, then we'd have to holiday here in the fountain. So we got a bit of early media, but that kicked off what soon became a major national issue. It was called the Fight for the Reef campaign to protect the Great Barrier Reef from coal expansion. And it was not surprising just how big an issue it became when you start to look at some of the impacts it has. So on the next slide, just kind of talking to those briefly, one of the biggest impacts is that these mines were proposed to be built on stolen Aboriginal land, the land of the Wangan and Jagalingou people, and I'll talk more about their struggle for justice shortly. Already talked about the climate impacts, but the Galilee Basin holds over 4.6 billion tonnes of carbon pollution. Impacts on the reef, of course, water. One of the staggering things here in Australia is that Queensland government, my state government, issued the coal companies here in the Galilee Basin a groundwater license that allows them to access 60 years of unlimited water for free. And that incensed a lot of people here, and I think speaks to the real power of the mining industry in Australia, that they can get away with those kind of concessions. So we had this situation where, the Great Barrier Reef, our big precious natural icon, was at risk. We had the government at all levels supporting a massive expansion of Australia's coal exports. They wanted to see overall a tripling of our exports. And in response to all these concerns, a massive community campaign was formed. So it was made up of tourism operators, concerned about the Great Barrier Reef, businesses, communities where the coal ports were proposed, like up in Mackay, and of course people in cities like myself that were concerned about the impacts of climate change. The next slide just shows the launch of the Stop Adani movement. So in the Galilee Basin, there were several key players wanting to open up coal mines. I think some of them are even players in Canada, people like Gina Reinhart and now Clive Palmer and other billionaires. And of course, mining giant Gautam Adani, who owns the Adani mine. So after a little while, it became clear that Adani was really the only player pursuing this most ridiculous plan with any real seriousness. All the other Australian companies largely walked away because it was deemed too expensive, unviable to access this remote coal deposit. Build the railway line, which was going to cost billions of dollars, and it was 300 kilometres from the coast. And so for the last 5 years, our campaign, it's called #StopAdani campaign, you see the sign in the bottom left there, has really focused on the Adani company and the Adani Carmichael coal mine that they wanted to build. And it was a mega coal mine. So when we say mine, we should say mega, but it was 6 underground coal mines, 6 open cut pits, not just a small mine. And it's become one of the most controversial projects in the world. And I think certainly Stop Adani, the name, has become synonymous with sort of the anti-coal movement in Australia. That next slide just shows a bit of the launch of how we launched that movement. So we said, well, we've got this big problem. Adani are really pushing ahead. We need to build a national movement to really fight back. And we kicked off in 2017 with a national roadshow. So big town hall community events, ones like this one that was held in Melbourne, with the explicit ask for people to join or host a local group in their community. And off the back of that, we had over 100 local community action groups called Stop Adani groups take off. And yeah, since then it's become one of the biggest movements in our history. So huge amount of grassroots actions over the last 5 years, from film screenings to actions at companies' offices that were funding Adani, door knocking, big human signs like you saw in the last photo, big rallies that effectively made Adani a household name and Stop Adani that big symbolic thing. And we took as a win the fact that Adani actually were forced to rebrand themselves as Bravas. They were so toxic that they had to rename themselves so they didn't have to talk about Adani anymore. If we go to the next slide, I wanted to sort of touch on, one of the most inspiring elements of the campaign is something I've had the privilege of being involved with, is the resistance of the Wangan and Jagalingou people. They are the traditional owners of the land where the mine is being built, and since 2012 have said no to the mine several times. They're very concerned about the mine, the damage the mine will do to their country and their songlines, and particularly a sacred spring system not far from the mine pit. And unfortunately, Adani have responded, in an extremely aggressive manner. They bankrupted an elder. They banned his son, Cody, who's pictured on the left side here, from practicing culture on their country. And our government is refusing to investigate recent destruction of some important sacred sites on the mining site. But, in an inspirational turn, they are continuing to resist. And Cody on the left side in this picture has actually kicked off and occupied an area of the mining lease, on the Adani mining lease, performing a cultural ceremony called Wandanangu. And they set an important historic legal precedence where they were testing their rights under the Queensland Human Rights Act to perform that cultural ceremony. They've been, just as of last week, they've been there 6 months, every single day in a boring practicing ceremony. And they're about 1 kilometre from the small mine pit that Adani's opened up. So that kind of horizon you can see in the background is the growing overburden from the small mine that Adani has opened up. This is huge testament to their ongoing resistance, and obviously they're calling for parts of that land to be given back to them, but also for their cultural sites to be protected. So I guess next slide is sort of like, where is the campaign at now? It's been almost a decade of community resistance to the project. The good news is that, broadly our campaign has been hugely successful. Of all the coal port expansions and other proposed coal mines in the Galilee basin, we have stopped them. We've stopped those coal port expansions. It's very unlikely now the other coal companies apart from Adani will build their mines, and that's largely because we've managed to delay Adani's own timelines by 8 years. So in that time, we've seen it become less and less viable, or those companies walk away. The bad news is that, we're up against a dogged, persistent and cashed up opponent. Gautam Adani happens to be the richest man in India right now, and they effectively could fund what would otherwise have been a very unviable prospect. And last year they completed construction of the railway line, and our goal and started digging their mine. And our goal now is to constrain that construction as much as possible and keep them accountable, and keep any other coal companies out. So that's kind of where it's at. The next slide, I just wanted to touch on, I guess, like some of the key strategies we've been using to, and I'm sure these will seem familiar to you, but I guess touch on some of the key strategies we felt were important, some of the wins we have had. And, it's been obviously a big diversity of strategy and tactics, throwing effectively everything at our disposal to stop the project. In the early days, a lot about challenging their legal approvals. In the middle to late years, we've had a big focus on stopping the money. So we successfully pushed all 4 Australian banks away from the project, saying they would not, getting them to commit that they would not fund this mine, and then forced Adani to self-finance. Off the back of that, we've also seen a lot of those banks develop coal and climate policies in the process, which has been a huge win. I think one of the more innovative things we've done is parts of our movement have really pressured contractors, so the companies that are employed on the ground to do the work. Here, Downer is a mining contractor that effectively project manages a lot of these larger mines, and by forcing them out of the project, Adani have had to use a lot of small, inexperienced subcontractors, which has led to mistakes on the ground, has cost Adani a lot of money. We've also had people on the front lines continuing to monitor and expose Adani's breaches on site. They've got a terrible environmental track record of ignoring environmental conditions. And so we're always, as well as having people taking frontline action on the ground, so stopping Adani where it's possible during that construction phase. So there's been a big range of strategies. I think touching on some of the bigger, broader impacts we've had. If we go to that next slide, that's just, last year we reached a milestone of forcing 100 companies to pass policies to refuse work on the Adani Carmichael project. And that has been effectively a strategy of pushing all our grassroots efforts to one target, and taking actions at their offices, hammering them in whatever way we can, and then shifting to the next one. And I think we're starting, if we go to the next slide, starting to see, the beginning of the end for coal finance, and the Stop Adani campaign has played a part in really helping spearhead a broader shift from the finance sector away from coal. So, we saw big players, not just here in Australia, but also in China, Europe and USA, rule out the Adani Carmichael mine. And as I said, often those big companies, when you're targeting them, they'll say to us, well, we can't possibly rule out this one project. It's commercial in confidence. We couldn't possibly make a policy just about the Adani Carmichael mine. So they've often then had to develop a policy around coal or climate more broadly, which is where we've started to see the broader impacts of the campaign across those sectors. So, for example, Westpac Bank, which is a major bank in Australia, they didn't just rule out Adani, they brought in a policy to not fund any new thermal coal basins. And I think we can say that was largely off the back of the Stop Adani movement pressure. So in fact, of the 100 companies that have ruled out Adani, 2/3 of those companies have also got policies in around coal or climate change. I think we're moving into a phase where, a lot of these companies are making commitments, and it's our job as people-powered movements to keep those accountable to those commitments, because they say all the right things, but often their policies don't reflect those goals of the Paris agreements. And so we have a huge job on our hands to kind of cut through the greenwash and hold them accountable. So that's kind of touching on the finance. Another area, so if you go to the next slide on coal insurance, we've been working with our partners across the globe, particularly in London, is for the last 18 months has to look at the insurance sector. And, every coal mine across the country or across the world needs insurance. You cannot open and operate a mine without it. And so this is part of a new piece of work we've been working on to target, as with a whole bunch of movement partners, to target insurers. And for now, or to date, over 40 major insurers have ruled out financing the project. For a while there, we were focusing on the Lloyd's of London, which is a marketplace in the UK that sort of a last resort for fossil fuel companies to go to for insurance. They cobble together a whole bunch of insurance for uninsurable projects. And I'll talk about that in a second. But I think the broader impact of this work with our movement partners is, we're starting to see mounting costs and for those companies to get insurance, and increasingly difficult for new coal mines to get insurance as well. That photo is just ARC was one of the potential insurers for the Adani mine. We had actions at their offices sort of all over the country. So the next slide sort of talks to one of the biggest wins we've had in the last 18 months is that by pressuring that Lloyd's of London marketplace, they then developed a world first climate policy for them to rule out insuring any new coal mines. And significantly, that marketplace insures 40% of the world's fossil fuel projects. So I think this is a really important example of how we can use a toxic project like the Adani campaign or the Adani mine to really spearhead and help trigger broader shifts across these insurance and finance sectors. Coming close to the end, but I wanted to touch on in the next slide, I guess, some key ingredients to success I've observed across some of that Stop Adani work I think, obviously this is a big national campaign. We had a lot of groups as a part of that campaign and a high degree of collaboration across those movement partners, from, small grassroots groups on the grounds to tourism operators and bigger NGOs. So I think an important thing has been actually having the resources to coordinate that work, make sure we're on the same page, that we're complementing each other, that we're sharing resources where we can. In terms of the Stop Adani movement, I think we've had a huge amount of success in a directed network. So this is the idea that you have a centralized strategy. So we picked those movement targets that we go over after, whether it was Westpac Bank or Downer, and that we would do it all at once, and that grassroots local groups had a decentralized implementation of that strategy. So they had the autonomy to do that strategy on the ground, but there was a centralized strategy that had the latest intel about research and policy. I guess the broader thing is thinking about what are the key pillars of support for the project. So when we first looked at this, we felt like the finance and particularly insurance was the biggest pillar of support for that project that we could go after. And so thinking about, if you're campaigning, putting yourself in the opponent's shoes, what can you take out that will have the biggest impact on the project at that point in time? In the last couple of minutes, I guess I did just want to touch on, I might not be able to touch on all of these things, but what about all the other coal mines? Well, if we cut to slide 28, maybe we can share these slides somehow, but I guess this points to, the broad range of strategies we're seeing when it comes to all of those other coal mines that we're fighting across the country. And it really is a diverse range of tactics, from, building an important story to targeting the finance, to doing that engagement in the approvals process. as someone who's worked with the grassroots movement, we've done much more of that targeting actions on the ground, particularly going after companies. I wanted to touch on, maybe we'll just touch on one win and then skip forward, is, in the last couple of years, so that's this on the Rocky Hills slide, Annalise, but we've had a large number of big wins that have come after the back of decade-long community fights, and we are starting to see the courts finally shift the dial when it comes to recognising the climate and social impacts of coal mines across the country. If you flick to the next one, that's another mine that was a 10-year fight led by traditional owners and farmers on the Liverpool Plains in New South Wales. They also started to do things like pushing BlackRock, the world's biggest money manager, to take out their investments in the company and force the government to buy back their licenses. I might skip that Baralabar one because we don't have time, but I guess I just wanted to, so if we're on slide 32, think about this opportunity of finance, because we are, where we're headed next is really to zone this big pillar of support for the industry. Like, Australian banks continue to fund coal mines despite these commitments. There's huge loopholes in their current policies. And, without concerted community pressure, I don't think these companies are going to stop funding these dangerous projects until too late. So that's going to be a huge point of our focus in the future. If we go to the next slide, we've got big opportunities here. We know that only 5 companies in Australia produce 60% of all our coal, including Glencore, BHP, Yancoal. That's a great point of intervention. We want to think about how we can target those. And on the next slide, we're thinking about, well, it's really only 4 banks in Australia that are funding all of Australian coal mining. Can we target those banks to get big wins across the sector? Same with contractors. What are the big points of intervention in our industry that we can target? Finally, I just wanted to say, change is coming. The second last slide here, like here in Australia, we know that most Australians think we need to get out of coal as soon as possible. While there are big expansions on the cards, coal is becoming increasingly unprofitable and hard to fund. I think our job now is to keep those companies accountable to not funding those mines. And we know that, long, dedicated community campaigns can win, but it takes time. It's taken a decade or more for a lot of these campaigns to finally come to fruition and to finally beat the companies that have been fighting. And finally, I just want to say thank you for listening. I hope it was useful. Would love to connect with anyone if you've got questions or feedback. That's my email. The Stop Adani campaign is there. Standing Our Ground website is the Wangan and Jagalingou Cultural Custodians if you want to support their work resisting and protecting country on the ground. And finally, I did want to just share that last website, great new website, where you can look up any of the finance for companies on the global coal exit list. So it's over 1,000 companies. Might be a useful tool. Otherwise, I will leave it there and look forward to the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you, Moira, for sharing the amazing work that's happening. And it must feel good to have some success behind, so often activism, it's hard to see your success, so it's nice to see some of the success here that you're suddenly having. I'll jump right to the queue. Jim McPhail, what next with Adani finally starting up?
Yeah, great question. And we've got some grassroots gatherings where we're bringing together the movement to talk about just this in a couple of weeks' time. But I think really important that we continue to stand with Wangan and Jagalingou cultural custodians. I guess one of the learnings from me is as climate activists, we're very often wanting that. The urgency is very pressing for us. We want to stop this now. We know it's a very urgent crisis, but I guess I've learned from working with them that this is a really long struggle for land justice, that it's a 200-year struggle for here in Australia fighting colonialism, and they are in a very long fight. And so I think first and foremost, continuing to support their work in, resisting Adani and fighting to protect country. more broadly, while we think there are opportunities to constrain Adani, they aren't necessarily, like by keeping them accountable to conditions and things on the ground, they aren't really conducive to building a big people-powered movement, which is the work sort of we've been focusing on. So right now we're thinking about, well, how can we take a lot of the lessons of the Stop Adani campaign, the stuff we've learned around particularly pressuring companies, I would say, to change and hit some of the bigger coal targets that are driving a lot of the coal expansions in Australia and across the world. Money managers like BlackRock that still invest $85 billion in coal globally, despite saying they're, climate leaders. So I think there's lots of work to do, and that's some of the work we want to do is how do we apply those lessons to the broader coal industry.
Next question comes from Leona Jacobs. How does your government square the abundant use of water by coal mining with the needs of the arid lands of Australia? What arguments do they use to justify this?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to this one. And yeah, it is always surprising to me that the agriculture industry doesn't have the lobbying power that the mining industry does here, right? Because it's not just for the environment we need that water, but a lot of landholders that farm that land need the water, and they're often outcompeted. Yeah, so I don't know where that amount of power for the mining industry has and the stranglehold they have on government, and it does surprise me how little the agricultural industry sort of fights back against that stuff. Yeah, and I think there's a big narrative here of the mining industry overinflating their importance. In terms of, like, the reality is the number of jobs in the mining industry here is actually very small. It's less than the number of people that work at Woolworths, our major, supermarket, but they're very good at telling a story about how our economy will fall apart if the mines close. I'm sure that's a familiar one, but they're very good at telling that narrative that, the royalties we get from these mines, the jobs they provide, are the single backbone to Australia's economy. And it's a very powerful and effective narrative they've been running for a long time. So it's sort of like everything else is out the window, if it's biodiversity, if it's water, if it's First Nations rights, if it's climate.
Knut Peterson, great to hear from an Aussie. Aside from people caring about our environment and climate change, particularly ranchers have played a major role here in Alberta stopping coal mining here so far. Your comments, please.
Yeah, that's amazing to see. I've seen some of that stuff from afar. One of my first roles on this campaign was working with some landholders along the railway line from the coast, the proposed railway line from the coast into the mine, and whether we could get them collaborating to oppose that railway line. And some of the challenges were, across the Adani line that was 300 kilometres long, there was only 16 landholders. That gives you a sense of how big the properties are out there in central Queensland. They very rarely talk to each other. And Adani had got in so early that they'd often had put in confidentiality agreements in place for those landholders. So they couldn't speak to each other about the agreements they were negotiating with Adani. And a lot of those landholders effectively felt like they had a gun to their head. They could either negotiate with Adani, the company, or they would have their property compulsorily acquired by the state government, and effectively they had no choice. So even if they opposed the railway line, which some of them did, less for coal reasons, more for the fact that it was disrupting a fragile floodplain, because they built the railway line through a floodplain, but they had no out. They had no choice. They either negotiate with Adani, get some compensation, or they get their land compulsory acquired by the state government. So yeah, big challenges here in having landholders having the support to stand up to mining companies.
Our next question comes from Ian Hurdle. A majority of protest in Alberta is the threat to our mountain east slopes wildlands. Are there similar areas in Australia?
That are like big natural areas that are under threat.
Could you clarify that, Ian?
Is that
I'm assuming so. I think it is around, like for Alberta, it's around the threat of the mountain east slopes, the wildlands there. But are there similar sort of movement around the protection of the land that is a wilderness land there in Australia?
Yeah, I think one of the early things we did was obviously focus on the thing that most people identified with, which was the Great Barrier Reef. So when there was plans, and so early days we were really focusing on that port expansion and the impacts it was going to have, and like the industrialization of the reef that was going to happen. So I guess in a way that was our biggest landscape, iconic landscape that was under threat. The actual land in like, what's the word? Inland Queensland, I guess, is less iconic. Like, it is really beautiful, and it's especially after rain. There's a lot of diverse and threatened ecosystems. But that was a challenge that when we actually stopped we effectively stopped the coal ports, a lot of that reef framing fell away, and we had to like refocus the focus on climate and stopping the mine. And we didn't have like an iconic, beautiful ecosystem that we could point to that was going to be destroyed, because it's broadly like pretty scrubby, I guess you could say, very dry. Even though I think it's beautiful, it's not traditionally beautiful. So that was another challenge for the campaign as well.
Leona Jacobs, how did you make this a national movement of coal writ large versus... So, sorry, I'll start again. How did you make this a national movement of coal writ large versus a regional one of specific mines?
Yeah, great question. I think we were lucky that the scale of it, like, it was so, we weren't just talking, and there are a lot of mines that are much smaller and that maybe this strategy wouldn't work. But the sheer scale of the expansions they were planning was so big, the fact that it would dwarf Australia's emissions nationally every year from the Galilee basin, the fact that it was going through the Great Barrier Reef, one of the biggest precious national icons, helped us tell a story that this was a big national threat, and that we needed to kind of band together to fight this threat. And so I think we did, be able to, and by the point that all the other companies had ruled out and we were down to Adani, and we became the Stop Adani campaign, it was a very powerful, people love a good villain. It was going after one villain. And I think there's really interesting reflections, because we've certainly had feedback that like Stop Adani is a negative campaign. It's it doesn't talk to the solutions. It doesn't talk to the transitions for coal communities, and definitely learned hard lessons from that, and keen to hear how you're managing those tensions too. But it's really hard to go past like just front and centering the enemy, and in terms of purely motivating your base of people against that. And so when we launched the Stop Adani movement, it was those big town hall. We basically said, like, we actually thought we'd won the campaign. This is a few years ago. We thought we'd won the campaign. We thought there was no way they could build this thing. The coal price was low. That a few different things happened. The government stepped in to give them some money. The coal price went up again, and all of a sudden it was back on. And we actually had to make a deliberate decision to come back in, kickstart the campaign again. And we said, well, how do we make this the biggest national movement? And that's where the idea of the roadshow came off, which is just like, we can't, it's also a challenge. Hardly anyone lives near the mine, right? Like we can't have, there's like one or two properties surrounding the mine. So this was going to have to be a national movement driven by people largely in cities. And that's come with its challenges because I would say we don't have a strong community element to that resistance like some of those other projects have had, and that's definitely been a challenge as well. But yeah, I think that tension for all campaigns around, like, are you telling this positive story about what you want to protect, like whether it's the wildlands versus going after the villain because it's a powerful motivator for action, is actually really challenging. And I would say we did both. We had Fight for the Reef at the start of the campaign, which was about protecting the reef, and then we switched to Stop Adani. Once we'd won the port, we'd stop the port expansion. So yeah, keen to hear how other people are managing those tensions in campaigning, I guess.
For sure. Our next question comes from Sybil Mansmith. Have some of the coal companies tried to influence the Aboriginal communities to bring them to bring them over to their side? And if yes, how did they do this?
Yeah, that's a really long, sad story. It feels like the the and the Wangananjangalingu website has a long history of this, and I don't understand all elements of it, but effectively they held here in Australia, mining companies have to form an Indigenous land use agreement with the traditional owners in order for their approvals to get their mine to go ahead. And our understanding is that Adani effectively held a sham meeting, so they bussed in W&J Wangananjangalingu traditional owners to vote on this meeting, but they actually physically kept out some of the most important spokespeople of that meeting. And so Adani have been, they paid people who didn't really know much about the project, who were maybe taken by some of the compensation they might get and signed off on it. But it wasn't a true representative consultation. And so, the Wangananjangalingu Family Council, who are the true representatives and spokespeople, have been for a long time trying to undo a narrative that Adani effectively had consultation. They had an ILUA, a land use agreement. So yeah, those, and I think that's a strategy the mining industry uses here, is they divide families, Aboriginal families, by offering compensation, and they force them to choose a side. And they're not honest about the impacts and the true compensation they'll get from those projects either. It's a complicated story, but certainly a lot of dirty tactics on their part.
Mark Goodall, could you say a little something about how you targeted banks via picketing in front of them and using coal or black babies? That's in quotation marks. I believe it was.
Oh yeah, to bring a photo up about that. There's some, I think, you guys have Extinction Rebellion in Canada? They there? Yeah, some of the Extinction Rebellion crew who've been part of the Stop Adani campaign here, they definitely go for that more confronting visual imagery. And so they had some kids, like dolls, I guess, that are like kids, piled with coal over them. So, and then put them out in front of these banks. So, it's quite confronting when you're walking down the street and you see a kid buried in coal. But that was one, I guess, visual tactic. There was a lot of tactics when it came to the banks that sort of escalated over time. So, it'd start with emails, then escalate to phone calls, and then, a lot of groups took bolder action, like sitting in their branches, doing queue-ins where they wait to open a bank account and then close it again straight away because they've had a conversation about how they're involved in investing in Adani or coal or whatever. So there's a lot of creative tactics that came out in that banks campaign, and I think one of the reasons we're interested in focusing on that is, like, here, I don't know about there, but a lot of those major banks have branches everywhere, right? So we had people in towns, it wasn't just major cities, it was in the smallest regional town that a few people could go and take action, be part of a big national movement. And And the bank is like, what? They're protesting in Albury Wodonga, you know, tiny towns, not just like big cities. Really shows that you've got a big movement of people that are concerned about this, and there's going to be real disruptions to their business unless they do the right thing.
Right. Our next question comes from Ian Hurdle. A major problem in Alberta is selenium pollution to our waterways, and in particular air pollution. Is it similar there?
Yeah, is there big impacts to air pollution?
And selenium in the water, the wastewater?
Yeah. I think you guys do well. I've spent a bit of time in the Appalachian Mountains doing some stuff with some groups there on coal. Seems like they were way ahead of us in terms of monitoring for heavy elements in water and using that as a way to kind of hold those companies account and launch legal strategies to, you know, stop pollution in waterways. I don't think we've probably used that to our fullest extent. I'm not sure about selenium specifically. In terms of air pollution, yeah, it's an interesting one. Like that stat, I was surprised at that stat, around 3,000 people that are, you know, prematurely die because of coal pollution, basically pollution from mining and burning of coal, including in coal power stations. And there are some groups here that have been using that as strategies, in particular to help hasten the closure of our coal plants, less the mines, because they're more remote, but often the plants are a bit closer to human residents. I mean, yeah, one of the challenges, you know, we did start to talk about air pollution as part of the Galilee Basin campaign, but one of the challenges is people are so far from those coal trains, so far from the mine, that there wasn't enough community concern about that as a specific impact. But I think certainly where you've got high density of people next to that polluting infrastructure, it's started to come in. And I think groups like there's some groups like Environmental Justice Australia, Climate and Health Alliance here that are starting to use that to pressure for, you know, better conditions on coal plants to try and you know, like hasten the closure of those coal plants effectively.
The next question comes from Beth Mundell. What advice do you have for us in Alberta, where Australian mining companies are trying to do the same here they did in Oz?
Yeah, you guys have got Gina Reinhardt, do you? A few others I was speaking to. Yeah. Great question. I mean, I guess, yeah. God, it's tough, isn't it? I mean, I think one of the ways to cut it is to, you know, think about, are you going after the company or are you going after the pillars of support for that company? So are you going after, do you have enough information about who's backing, like what's making that project possible? And I think, at least from a, you know, I'm not a legal expert, I don't do a lot of the research, so I'm more kind of grassroots power building side of things. And I think one of the things we've learned is that, you know, even though we created a big movement, we still had to be really focused, and we could only really pressure one target at a time. Like if we were going after a bank, we had to make sure all of our resources were going towards targeting that bank at that time, until we could, which then did create domino effects. You know, if one bank moves, it's more likely that another bank will then bring in a policy. I think that was one of our key learnings, is you do have to be like incredibly focused. Like we are up against powerful enemies, and for us to have enough power, targeting until you win and then moving on, was useful for us in terms of the finance campaign. Happy to keep chatting. I mean, I guess it's really dependent on the stage that those mines are into, right? Like, are they in that stage where you don't have enough community awareness? Like there was literally a very big stage of just building awareness about the fact this project was happening, about the impacts of the project, to get it to a point where it was in people's consciousness and they knew about it and they could talk about it as well.
All Our next question. Leona Jacobs just has a comment re narratives. We are hearing the same narratives here where Australian coal companies are trying to root in our eastern slopes the water tower for the Canadian prairies, right? So that's just a comment. Next question comes from Laura Schultz. What countries is Australia coal exporting to? Do citizens of those countries push back to importing coal based on climate change?
Yeah, great question. Largely we export to Asia, so I think Japan, Korea, are China are the top ones. And yeah, there has been an inspiring sort of Japan beyond coal movement that is starting to look at that, and obviously there were some moves with China starting to look at banning imports of coal that were going to be possibly useful. So yeah, I think it's a great point. It's like, and I don't do much of this work, but some of the people I work with have started to make connections with those groups to, just connect and see if we can support each other in some way. Certainly, yeah, if we can constrain demand, then that's a big way to solving the problem we have. Yeah.
Our next question comes from Knut Peterson. Although any reason to fight coal mining is arguably good, the fight here in Alberta in many cases probably is more about not in my backyard, NIMBY, because the potential of water/air pollution.
Yeah, and that can be really powerful motivator, like I would say you don't have to necessarily create this big national campaign if that's not where you're at. And a lot of those wins that I shared at the end and that I had to kind of skip through that I haven't been part of, but other communities, particularly a group here called Lock the Gate Alliance, supports communities to do just that, to fight those mines in their backyard and to give them the resources they need to do that. And I think it's taken a huge toll on those communities, often year-long court battles, big community campaigns, a lot of energy. And so obviously it's great to, where you can, draw on the resources of bigger NGOs and groups that can provide national support. But I also think it's one of the most powerful things you've got, right? Because it's people on the ground resisting, saying no, constant thorn in the side of those companies, constant intel into what they're doing. Like those kinds of campaigns have had, big wins here, like particularly around the gas movement in Australia, where there's, on-ground blockades, community resistance from the get-go. So hopefully you've got, enough resources within your community that's a really strong campaign in itself.
Knut's second part to that question. Sorry, there was a second part. It skips down the thread a bit, so I missed it. Sorry, Knut. Second part to that question was many people in Lethbridge, for example, work in the coal mines a few miles away across the mountains in British Columbia. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing we haven't done very well. Like I would say largely our national movement was made up of, it was much more probably diverse at the start, but in the last few years has much more been made up of city people concerned about climate change. And that's been another big critique of the campaign, is that we have not engaged well enough the communities and the workers that are impacted, because effectively, their power and their vested interests and the genuine legitimate concerns they have been a big reason why we haven't, moved out of coal quicker than we otherwise would have. So, yeah, it's another big question, hey, for our campaigns is like, do we have the capacity to engage those people? Who's best placed to do that work, that transition work?
Okay, our next question comes from Leona Jacobs. A counter-argument for mining is the importance of these mining projects to local to the mine economy. How was that addressed in Australia?
Can you say that one
Yeah,
just
you
one more
bet.
time?
A counter argument for mining is the importance of these mining projects to local to the mine economy.
Local economies, yeah.
And
How do we counter that? Yeah. We've got a group here called the Australia Institute that do a lot of great research around like what are the real impacts of mining. And, you know, for example, they showed that a lot of the impacts that the mining industry said they had through the mining boom here, you know, didn't meet up to the actual numbers. So, for example, they would say that like mining is great for regional jobs and regional economies, and the Australia Institute showed that actually overall there was negative impacts on employment because the mining industry was just taking skilled workers from manufacturing or agriculture, giving them heaps of money, paying them heaps of money, and sucking them from other places that they were needed. So it wasn't like the mining industry was out there employing people that didn't have jobs. They were effectively creating a skill shortage. They didn't do the training of those workers, and they sucked it out from other industries that needed them. So that's one strategy that's been done here, is to try and tell the true story of those impacts. But I'd say it's incredibly difficult, and overall we're failing to tell that real story. Yeah.
our last question for today comes from Ian Hurdle. Premier of Alberta, very on board for coal mining in spite of a majority of the population against. Is it the same for head of Queensland government?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the Queensland government is trying to, you know, Queensland's one of the sunniest places in the world, right? We should be like transitioning to renewables yesterday. And I think one thing they're trying to do now is do both. They're trying to say we can expand into renewables, but we can also build more coal mines and we can still meet our climate targets. And so, yes, our Premier of Queensland is very, very supportive of all new coal projects going ahead. She's also happy to talk about the need for climate change and all the good work they're doing in renewables. And I think it's our job as a movement to say, well, actually, you know, physics and science means you can't do that and still meet your climate targets. And that was one of the things we tried to do through that campaign. And we did force them to stop a $1 billion loan to Adani, which was a huge political win as part of the campaign. They were going to hand out $1 billion of taxpayer money to the company, and we stopped that loan by purely just saying this is a bad use of taxpayer money. But yes, there's full support for the mining industry, I'd say, particularly in Queensland, where that narrative of the backbone, the mining backbone of our economy is particularly strong.
Okay, and Ian Hurdle also has a comment just saying that there's a paper by Hendricks on air pollution in Oz. So the name is Hendricks. Many thanks for your time and for your presentation. Really fascinating to hear what's happening in Australia. Before we end the session, do you have a take-home message for us, please?
I would say, you know, we are up against for those who are part of coal campaigns, we're up against a really powerful industry, but we are turning the tide. And, you know, a lot of people will tell you you're not having a difference. Our opponents, the Murdoch press, our climate deniers will say, oh, you're not having an impact. That's because they don't want you to know that. And I think we've shown, you know, through this campaign and others that that's the only thing that's going to slow down and eventually end this industry, is a lot of us holding those companies to account and resisting in whatever way we can. So, yeah, big solidarity to all of you fighting coal projects across Alberta. Yeah, we're with you, and obviously it's a big global effort we're in at the moment.
Well, on behalf of SACPA, thank you very much for your time. There's many thank yous in the queue. Leona Jacobs, thank you so much for sharing. Jim McPhail, Fair Duncan, Moira, and then Sybil Mansmith, thank you for your presentation. And Ian Hurdle and Knut Peterson, the list goes on of thank yous. And Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And for our listeners, we won't have a session this Thursday, but we will next week Thursday at our usual time at 12 noon Mountain Standard Time with Ibrahim Toure. Is storytelling a means to reveal racism in the daily experience of people of color? And I hope you'll join us for that. And with that, we'll wish you all a good night.